welcome back everyone. Today we continue with the next part of this series called What If Future Gohan Was Never Killed by the Androids. Let's aim for 350 likes on this one. Also, don't forget to leave a comment letting me know if you've enjoyed the series so far. With that, let's begin. There stood a lone demi-sane teen, his jean jacket and baggy dark pants beaten up and torn, revealing many bleeding sections of his skin. He faced two destructive ice djinns, each with a glint of evil in their eyes. The teen's aura flared as he took in the destruction surrounding him. He stood on dirtied, bloody cement that bore several devastating cracks from the incredible battle that must have taken place before he'd arrived. He quickly glanced around, surveying the crumbled gray buildings and the multitude of unfortunate bodies scattered around the battlefield. They did this. Amongst the dead bodies lay Grandpa Gohan, his body still and limp. Trunks swore to himself that he would grant the well-deserving Saiyan a proper burial once he'd taken his revenge. "You two will pay for what you've done," Trunks said menacingly, his words reinforced by his recent Super Saiyan transformation. The Ice Djinn Rhyme responded, annoyed, "Pay for what we've done. Real original, dumbass." "Geez, I wonder how many times I've heard that line." Nivius chuckled at his companion. "What's funnier is we've hardly done anything yet. For the most part, we've just been sitting in the ship, waiting to take on the Super Saiyan. I mean, I know there were those robotic hominoids, but they don't really count." The Ice Djinn's words slowly trailed off as Nivius tilted his head, eyes staring at the emptiness filling the sky. Trunks assumed he'd been reimagining the battle with the robotics mentioned before. They're talking about robotics. Do they mean the other androids? Wait, are they that powerful? Self-doubt began to fill the boy's thoughts as he imagined the strength necessary to destroy just 16, let alone 3 others. "We had quite the trouble taking down the other Super Saiyan," Nivius said as his voice picked up and his words regained clarity. "And now we have another," he groaned as he stared at Trunks. "I honestly don't know if I can handle another." "Shut up, Nivius. We can handle this." Rhyme glared at Trunks, examining his wounds and dirtied clothing carefully. "We might actually have an advantage here. It looks like he sustained quite a lot of damage beforehand. Not to mention that new Super Saiyans are always rather weak compared to the experienced." "How do you know that?" the masculine Ice Djinn asked, bringing his hand up to the side of his face and pressing on the scanner, triggering its number configuration. "It says here that he's nearing 150,000. Though not nearly as powerful as the other one, it's still strong." Rhyme smiled as her complacent friend spoke. "That doesn't matter. We can overpower him easily, not to mention." Her sentence suddenly halted as a bright red flash blinded the 3 fighters. Trunks blinked rapidly as he attempted to regain his sight. After a few seconds, he was finally able to see and was surprised to witness the 2 Ice Djinns lying sprawled out on the ground. "What the?" Trunks pondered in awe. His question was answered as 18 slowly floated down next to him. "I have no clue why you let them talk for so damn long. I couldn't help but blast them." She took a quick glance at Grandpa Gohan's still corpse and grimaced. "He's not dead, is he?" she asked nonchalantly. Trunks continued to glare at the 2 aliens who began to slowly push themselves to their feet. He responded with a sad nod. The android groaned as she watched his head movement. Grudgingly, she said, "Damn it, I wanted to be the one to do him in." Trunks ignored her comment and focused on the rising form of Rhyme. She stood and rubbed the sore part of her chest, which had taken the brunt of the blast, before catching sight of her new enemy. The moment her eyes landed on 18, she released a loud series of strange words. Judging by her angry arms flailing at the air, Trunks assumed she was swearing in an obscure language. Nivius slowly pushed himself back to his feet and stared bewildered at Rhyme's sudden explosion of rage. When he too saw 18's casual figure, his eyes widened, and his body shook severely as fear overwhelmed him. Finally, Rhyme's angry ranting ceased, and she glared at 18 before murmuring, "The damn cyborg's here. Sigh, I think we'll have to retreat for now." Nivius nodded, his frightful eyes still pinned to 18's amused figure. Quietly, the android leaned over and whispered to Trunks, "I had no idea that even aliens knew to be afraid of me." She allowed a light chuckle to escape her lips at the idea of quivering alien species. Trunks cracked his knuckles, ignoring 18, and decided to shout out, "You two aren't going anywhere. You die right here, right now." The young demi-saiyan watched curiously as Rhyme leaned over her ally's shoulder and whispered something incomprehensible into his ear. The fear he expressed suddenly lessened as he looked down and began to fiddle with a device strapped to his arm. His fingers moved as if he were typing at a keyboard, sweat nervously dripping down the side of his cheek. Trunks shouted across the battlefield, "What's he doing?" Rhyme returned her attention to the demi-sane and android with a mischievous smile before saying, "Oh, nothing to worry about. Just, what is the term you use on this planet? Texting a friend, I believe it is?" "Like hell you are," the angry teen shouted before launching himself at the Ice Djinn. As he flew towards her, he shot a shining beam at her chest, which she narrowly avoided. The moment she leapt to the side to dodge the blast was the moment he converged on her, striking the side of her neck with a powerful chop. The Ice Djinn stepped away, rubbing the now sore part of her throat, unaware of the kick soon to sweep out her legs. She hit the ground with a grunt and watched fearfully as Trunks raised his foot and stomped downward, prepared to smash the limb into her face. Rhyme rolled to the side and felt the debris of dirt splatter against her face as the Super Saiyan's foot plowed through the hard ground. Trunks violently ripped his shoe out of the ground and watched as the Ice Djinn sprung to her feet before gingerly taking a few steps away from the Super Saiyan. She wiped some blood away from the corner of her mouth and said, "Not bad, kid. Not bad, but you'll have to do far better than..." Wait. Her head whipped back and forth as she frantically searched for 18, who had disappeared the moment Trunks had struck. Trunks grinned as he saw the android floating just a few feet behind the Ice Djinn, her finger pistol ready and locked onto Rhyme. It was odd to feel confidence at the sight of the murderous android. Conflicting emotions welled up in his stomach at his approval of the android's assistance. The teen quickly reminded himself, "She's just another enemy, Trunks. Don't let yourself forget that. You'll have to destroy her the moment you get the chance." Finally, the Ice Djinn gave up in her search for the female and shouted back at Niveus, who was still fiddling with the device on his arm. "Find anything?" The larger Ice Djinn nodded as his eyes locked onto whatever the screen was displaying. "I think I have, though it seems like her entire brain isn't mechanical like the androids. There is a single section affected by some delicate machinery." Trunks cocked his head, confused as to what they were talking about. Though, judging by the shaken look strewn upon 18's face, it seemed that she knew exactly. "Well, can you shut her down like the others?" Rhyme shouted, now desperately searching for the android. "I don't know what the device affects, but I'll deactivate it nonetheless. Hopefully this works." His head finally looked up from the screen and stared at Rhyme before catching sight of 18 floating behind her. His eyes widened as he shouted, "Behind you!" Rhyme spun around, readying herself for whatever attack was to come, but the action only caused the beam to pierce through her forehead rather than the back of her skull. The Ice Djinn fell back, her eyes wide and lifeless as she hit the ground with a thump. Niveus released a deafening, "No!" as he watched his companion fall to the ground. He whipped his head back up to where 18 was still floating and roared, "You'll regret that, you bitch. Watch as I shut you down, you piece of rusted junk." He snarled as he turned his attention back to the device on his arm. 18 shouted wildly as she flew towards the Ice Djinn. "Stop now! You will not mess with my..." The Ice Djinn looked up with a satisfied grin as he said confidently, "Already done." 18 froze the moment his words landed upon her eardrums. Her slow and shaky hand rose to the side of her forehead and delicately touched it, worried at the effects of his tinkering. After a few seconds of deadly silence, 18 finally released a relieved laugh as she figured whatever he'd done must have failed. She spoke confidently, aiming her finger pistol precisely at the spot between the Ice Djinn's eyes. "It seems like you've failed to do anything, you tech-savvy idiot. Though I must say that you had me worried for a second." Niveus took a step back in terror as he realized his plan hadn't worked. Whatever the device in her brain had been, it seemed irrelevant to her function. Or at least that's what he thought. 18 smiled wide as she understood what the foolish Ice Djinn had done. He'd somehow managed to connect to the invention placed in her brain and disable it in a frail attempt to stop her. She giggled as she realized that this alien invasion had done more for her than she could have possibly imagined. She would no longer have to worry whether or not her thoughts were her own or someone. Her neck tweaked to the side involuntarily, and her laughter stopped short. Meanwhile, her ability to speak halted, and slowly her vision dulled. Her sense of touch waned to the point of being unable to feel the very clothing on her skin before the ground came rushing towards her. Trunks stared awestruck as the android fell from the sky, limply bouncing off the ground and rolling a few feet before coming to a distinct stop. The teen was shocked. Though not saddened in any sense, he did find it somewhat disappointing that he wouldn't be able to rely on the android's immense strength. The feeling he'd felt the most, though, was a vast amount of confusion. His mind wrapped around itself as he tried to connect the evil aliens fiddling to 18's sudden malfunction. It didn't take long, though, for the sharp boy to figure it out. He recalled a time before now when he had spoken to his mother about what she had thought about 17 and 18. He reimagined the very moment Bulma had theorized the entirety of the android's creation. What had stuck out was what Bulma had said about their brains. The brief's residence, 5 years prior. A mother and son sat at the far back of the room. The walls reflected the several lamps hanging from the ceiling, illuminating the many strange mechanical materials placed haphazardly on the counters running along the walls. Bulma sat on a stool at the far back counter, fiddling with one of the incomplete devices in her hands. Trunks watched with wide eyes as she worked delicately with the machinery. He played with the frayed sleeve of his blue shirt as he watched, unaware that his unbelted jeans were about to slip from his hips. The pants fell, and Trunks yelped as he quickly pulled them back up, startling his mother and then enraging her. With a worried shout, she said, "Put a belt on! You scared the crap out of me." Trunks mumbled, "Sorry," as he held tightly to his slightly sagging pants. He'd seen some cool kids sagging their pants and had decided to duplicate it. He regretted the decision immediately. Bulma carefully connected a stray defiant wire to the circuit board she was programming. The yellow appendage had been giving her trouble throughout the entire process. Finally, she managed to weld the wire to its proper position and released a breath she'd been holding for far too long. She turned to her observant son and said with a relieved sigh, "All right, Trunks, I'm done. Ask your next question." Trunks smiled as his curious mind was being fed. "All right, Mom. You already told me why you think they're so strong, so why do you think they fight so well?" "They fight well, eh?" she said, re-examining her work, making sure there were no further complications. Trunks nodded with enthusiasm. "Yeah, Grandpa Gohan told me in one of our, Bulma lifted her head from her work and looked over at her son, disapproval written on her face. "You've been out training with Grandpa Gohan again, haven't you?" Trunks rubbed the back of his neck nervously as he studied the ground, a habit undoubtedly picked up from the son of Goku. "Yeah," he said sheepishly. "Sorry, Mom, I'm not in trouble, am I?" The mother's harsh facial features softened at the 9-year-old's innocent question. "No, son. I think it's good for a boy to get some exercise here and there." The lavender-haired boy perked up the moment her words were spoken, a smile again present on his face. Bulma added sharply, "But I don't want you fighting those androids. Hear me?" Trunks nodded quickly in response. "I hear you, Mom. I won't. I was just saying that Grandpa Gohan told me that the androids fought in a way that he'd never seen before." Bulma sighed in frustration as she realized her demand had been brushed aside by the boy's persistent questions. She decided to answer them so that she could hammer in a rule she'd never been more serious about in her entire life. She loved her son more than anything and would willingly give her life to save him, which was why she had such a problem with Trunks practicing martial arts. In all honesty, she had no problem with the child striving to learn to fight. Though it bothered her some that he was following in his father's footsteps, she had loved the man despite his obvious issues and respected that the boy wanted to take after him in some aspects. The only problem she had with Trunks learning to fight was why he wanted to. She knew the reason he consistently slipped off to train was that one day he dreamed of fighting alongside Grandpa Gohan. Bulma had spoken to the young man a few times concerning this, and Grandpa Gohan agreed that the lavender-haired child should never have to face the same struggles. The scarred Sen reassured her that the training lessons were only to be used in the worst-case scenario, if somehow the androids were to find him unprotected. This had lessened her fears and led her to support the occasional training sessions, though she knew that someday the boy would feel overconfident and venture off to confront the monsters plaguing their world. This is why she made a point of continuously hammering in the single most important rule she'd ever come up with in her life: do not challenge the androids. Trunks playfully waved his hand in front of his mother's face, hoping to regain her attention. The aging woman blinked several times before returning her gaze to her son. "Yes? You didn't answer my question," he said, annoyed. His arms crossed. "Oh, sorry, Trunks. What was your question again?" she asked sweetly. The boy let out an exaggerated sigh in annoyance, rolling his eyes as he did so. Bulma frowned as she witnessed this action. "Stop with the sass, Trunks." The boy stomped his foot and said with a serious tone, "I'm not being sassy." Bulma always got a kick out of the cute yet angry reaction she could get from her son. She knew she would regret the day he grew older and stopped being so childish. She smiled at his frustration and said, "All right, son, so what's the question again?" "My question's the same. Why do the androids fight so well?" he said, the annoyance in his tone dissipating. "Well," Bulma said thoughtfully, "from my short experience in the field of self-sustaining robotics, I always programmed all of the rules and instructions in the mainframe." Trunks said as he deciphered his mother's words. Finally, after the third time replaying her sentence in his mind, he understood. "So that means that all of their movements and stuff are pre-rendered." He prided himself on the usage of his last word. It was an odd one, and he enjoyed using it very much. "Well, sorta," she said as she moved a few strands of hair obscuring her vision behind her ear. She thought of a simpler way to get her message across as she completed the trivial task. "What I'm saying is that I'm pretty sure their fighting abilities and everything they know were probably programmed into them. It's far easier to program it in than to create a robot and then teach it how to fight." "Oh," the boy said as he finally understood. Bulma nodded at her son, pleased by the cute expression he displayed as he took in her words. Yep, of course, that's just my assumption based on my projects. Trunks said as his gaze dropped, his eyebrows crunching together, signaling another question was on the way. But wait. If all their moves were downloaded, does that mean that we could connect to them with Wi-Fi and stuff? Bulma fought to keep in her laughter. The child believed they could take over the androids' minds through the internet. She swallowed the humor and said politely, I doubt that, son. You see, the androids were released on this world just a few months after you were born. Back then, the internet wasn't as innovative as it is today, so it's pretty likely that they weren't designed with that sort of connection. Well then, how did they download the information they needed? Well, Bulma pondered. I'm guessing that they were built with a radio sensor, or perhaps their programs were installed through a cable. Trunks mumbled as he took in the information. Wait, does that mean that we could shut them down by somehow hacking into their, you said it was their mainframe. Could that be their brain? Bulma nodded accordingly before responding. That's something I ventured into before, Trunks, but I soon realized to do this I would need far more advanced technology than I do now. Perhaps somewhere in the future, we'll be able to do that. Why can't we do that now? Trunks asked stubbornly, convinced that he'd just found the answer to the androids. Bulma smiled at his confidence. You see, Trunks, we don't have radio receptors with a large enough radius to connect to the ever-moving androids, and speaking of speed, the androids are too fast for our limited technology to reach them usually. The older woman took a breath as she prepared to continue. There is a possibility that we'd be able to shut them down if we were to get close enough and have the time to hack into their databanks, but that would require a great deal of strength, speed, and especially luck. Bulma shook her head as she recalled the failed attempt Grandpa Gohan had made. The boy had been incredibly clever, using Tien's duplication technique to buy himself some time and hide in the buildings while he tried to connect to the two robotic monsters. Unfortunately, the androids easily took out the weakened clones and found him as he'd been trying to sneak closer for a better signal. They had destroyed his compact computer on the spot and left a scar on his back that lasted to this day. After a long pause, Bulma finally spoke again. We have yet to get the chance to pull off this theory, but again, it's only a theory. A theory that nearly cost Gohan his life. Wait, what? Trunks said in surprise. Gohan tried to hack into their data stuff? What happened? Bulma laughed at her son's never-ending questions. Find Gohan if you want that story. He'll be able to tell it better than I can. Trunks nodded enthusiastically before racing out of the room without so much as a goodbye. Bulma smiled as he left, happy that he'd taken after her when it came to his thirst for knowledge. The Demi-Sen shook his head to clear the rogue memories and focused his attention on the remaining Ice Jin. He didn't know how the alien before him had managed to corrupt 18's mainframe so quickly or how he knew that she'd shut down as she did. After allowing himself a few more seconds of thought, Trunks remembered that this creature was not of this world, and their technologies must be far more advanced than an outdated android from 15 years prior. In fact, now that he thought about it, he realized that it made sense these creatures were able to shut down Earth technologies. They had conquered space travel. No doubt a robot was simply child's play. Trunks realized this probably explained the lack of resistance he had seen the citizens of Earth put up. They hadn't given up. The devices they could have used to defend themselves were tinkered with. Nivius released a small chuckle that quickly evolved into maniacal laughter. The creature shouted ecstatically, "That was brilliant. With her disposed of, I no longer have to worry about my survival." Trunks shook his head and grumbled, "I wouldn't be so sure about that. You still have me to deal with." "True indeed," Nivius replied with a smile. "But you see, my earlier complaints were simply ones of exhaustion, not ones of terror. I know I will survive this fight, but will you?" Trunks watched, confused, as the confident Ice Jin began to rip away the shreds of armor still remaining on his body. Each chunk hit the ground with a boom that sent vibrations through the ground and to Trunks's feet. Once the last of the armor had been disposed of, Nivius stretched out his arms, moaning with pleasure as he did so. His body showed nearly no damage at all, as if the Ice Jin hadn't even been scratched during his bout with Grandpa Gohan. Meanwhile, Trunks still bore the multiple bruises and cuts strewn about his body. As Trunks assessed his energy levels, he realized that victory was nearly impossible. Even though he had surpassed the Ice Jin, the margin was tiny, barely enough to make a difference in a fight. Coupled with his lack of control over this immense strength and his energy slowly draining from prior injuries, things didn't look good for the young Demi-San. That doesn't matter, Trunks thought, glancing quickly at his master's limp form. Grandpa Gohan fought to his last breath, and so will I. The Ice Jin grinned, noticing Trunks' eyes on Grandpa Gohan. Hey, you understand now that your fate will be similar to your friends over there, right? We'll see, Trunks replied, determination hardening his voice. Garrow's lab. The woman fiddled with her long dark braid, contemplating what to do. It annoyed her endlessly that Trunks had forced her to stay behind, even if she understood the logic. I know I'm nothing compared to the Golden Warrior, Gohan, and it makes sense that his student would be far more powerful than me, but still. She sat cross-legged, pondering what she might have accomplished if she'd gone with Trunks. Her legs dangled off the ledge at the cave's mouth. She found it amusing that the stars looked so beautiful tonight. Yet it was from those same stars and planets that these aliens had come. How ironic it is that the galaxy we've wondered about innocently for so long wants to kill us, the woman said, managing to make out a constellation, the Dipper. Well, the old saying is that curiosity killed the cat, Bulma said, emerging from the cave. She had been tinkering with the old devices scattered around the work area. Despite several being outdated, she was amazed at what the old doctor had achieved with decade-old technology. She sat down next to the young woman, though it took her a hesitant second as the ledge revealed a sheer drop. She peered over the edge, whistling at the distance between her and the ground far below. So, Videl, why are you sitting out here in the cold night? I know it's gloomy in there, but it's definitely warmer than out here. Videl smiled at the older woman's concern. The cold doesn't bother me much. Besides, I want to see Trunks and Grandpa Gohan flying back victorious. Do you think Grandpa Gohan would show me how to become a golden warrior like that? Bulma laughed at Videl's childlike admiration. Sorry, but that transformation he goes through is something specific to his kind. I doubt anyone except Trunks will ever be able to replicate it. Oh, Videl mumbled, disappointed. She had wanted so much to transform and become the shining fighter she had watched on the news so many times before. Tugging at the stains coating her t-shirt, she asked, What exactly is Grandpa Gohan? Bulma hesitated, not wanting to reveal the Demisane's secrets without his consent. After battling many conflicting thoughts, she finally told herself, oh, to heck with it. There are thousands of angry aliens attacking Earth right now. What harm does it do to expose a friendly one? Bulma took a deep breath, preparing to say what she'd never said before. Well, you see, Grandpa Gohan isn't all human. I knew it, Videl exclaimed, her prediction confirmed. She drowned out Bulma's voice as she nearly shouted, I knew he couldn't be human. He's far too strong for that. I thought for a while that he could have been an android built to counter the monsters who'd sprung up way back then. But then I changed my mind when he started to grow up. Bulma smiled at Videl's excited and uplifting attitude. She allowed the young woman to finish before continuing. Yeah, there was definitely some speculation in the beginning, with some confused about who this mysterious child was. Videl frowned, recalling watching Grandpa Gohan's fights on the news bulletin. I remember that a lot of people said he was just another power-hungry fiend, a monster like the Saiyans who'd attacked Earth before. They thought the only reason he was fighting was to take control of the world himself. Bulma laughed nervously and murmured, well, I suppose that not all of the rumors were untrue. What? Videl shrieked in shock. Was Earth's savior really just another evil the world would have to suffer through? No, Bulma said, realizing how her words must have sounded. She quickly motioned with her hands for Videl to calm down. He's not a bad guy, trust me. He fights for a just cause and all that. A relieved sigh escaped Videl's lips as Bulma's words sank in. What I meant is, Bulma continued, Grandpa Gohan is, in fact, half Saiyan. Videl's mouth dropped open upon hearing this information. The world's savior was half monster. Beep. But the Saiyans were killed. How could there still be some left? Videl's mind flashed back to the news bulletins replaying the destruction the invaders had caused in their cities and armies. A message scrolled underneath the recap of destruction, saying that somehow, the aliens had been stopped and were no longer a threat to Earth. Well, one did survive, but I think you're under the impression that all Saiyans are evil, Bulma said, also recalling the news about Vegeta and Nappa all those years ago. Well, yeah. I was, but I guess half Saiyans aren't so bad. Huh, by the way, what's Grandpa Gohan's other half, if you don't mind me asking, Videl said, finally closing her jaw. Oh, he's human. Like you or me. Videl's mouth dropped open again. Really? You mean a human and a Saiyan? Yup, and had. Yup. Bulma smiled at Videl's dumbfounded responses, enjoying this far more than she'd expected. Wow, Videl said, falling back, her eyes wide with new knowledge as she stared up at the stars. I never thought there'd be something as cool as interspecies people here on Earth. Well, you learn something new every day, Bulma said nonchalantly, as if what she'd just revealed wouldn't blow anyone's mind. Wait a minute, Videl shouted, shooting up from her resting position and startling the blue-haired scientist. The young black-haired fighter turned to Bulma with intense curiosity. You said only your son could become golden like Grandpa Gohan. Does that mean Trunks is part Saiyan too? Bulma smiled at her excitement and nodded. Yup. Whoa, Videl said in amazement, then asked, how was that like? Bulma let her head fall back as she recalled her time with Vegeta. Exciting and terrifying. With a short laugh, Videl said, I'll bet. West City, Trunks. The fight had been far easier than Trunks had predicted. There was a significant skill difference between him and the Ice Jin that the Demi-Sane hadn't accounted for. As he fought, Trunks realized that his opponent must have been used to battling far weaker foes, relying on immense strength to compensate for a lack of skill. This made sense as Trunks remembered his mother telling him about their adventures on Namek, how Frieza and his race had no competitors when it came to strength. That was, of course, until Goku became the very first Super Saiyan in several hundred years. Trunks grunted as he felt a fist make contact with his temple, knocking him back a few feet before a thick tail wrapped around his leg and flung him haphazardly to the ground. The teen was back on his feet in no time, well prepared to knock away the large red Kai blast aimed at his chest. The beam created a blast radius the size of a house as it hit the ground several blocks away, the explosion taking much of the road and vaporizing some surrounding debris. Trunks caught sight of the dangerous Ice Jin floating several yards above his head, arms crossed and a smirk spread across his lips. Trunks scowled at the alien before shouting, Are you really feeling confident after that exchange? Your punch felt like a bug landed on my cheek. Nevius frowned before phasing out of sight. Trunks followed the creature out of the corner of his eye, keeping a distinct peripheral focus on the alien's energy source, allowing him to track the Ice Jin far easier than he'd been able to track the androids. I'm really glad I didn't stop with the sensory lessons. Trunks ducked suddenly as he sensed the Ice Jin's key signature rushing him from behind. He heard the wisp of a punch hitting air and smiled before whipping around with a sweeping kick, knocking the alien to the ground. The new Super Saiyan then leapt to his feet and stomped hard onto his opponent's stomach, causing a skin-crawling scream to emit from the Ice Jin. Nevius recovered quickly, swiping away the foot and performing his own leg sweep on the Centene. Trunks, however, was ready. He quickly curled his knees to his chest, watching carefully as the leg flew underneath his floating form. Timing it perfectly, he stomped down immediately, catching the leg in mid-sweep. His feet connected with Nevius's knee. With a loud snap, the knee gave way, forcing the leg to bend in a less than desirable way, and summoning another scream of pain from the Ice Jin. You piece of shit, the now crippled Ice Jin stuttered as he rose quickly into the air. He slumped over, feeling at his broken knee in dismay, gently rubbing it as he glared at Trunks. The teen merely grinned confidently and said, You do realize that means you lost a fight to a piece of shit, right? Trunks chuckled lightly at his own joke. Nevius shook his head, the initial rage from his leg injury subsiding. No, you fool. I have not lost. I will still be the victor of this battle. You'll see. Trunks rolled his eyes at the alien's misplaced confidence. Couldn't he see when he was beaten? The teen's eyebrows scrunched as he saw the Ice Jin point his 2 index fingers at him. Trunks tilted his head in confusion. You placing bets or what? I don't blame you for choosing me if that's the case. Die, was the only word Nevius muttered before bright red flashes lit the sky. Trunks gasped as the first beam tore through his shoulder, the unexpected wound leaving him open for a second beam that burned a small hole through his opposite right thigh. The golden-haired Demi-Sane released a lion-like roar as he surrounded himself with a strong yellow-tinted key shield, deflecting the following beams onto the already destroyed street he stood upon. Trunks's uninjured hand went to the bleeding wound on his shoulder, attempting to stop the blood flow. The effort failed as the blast had passed straight through, leaving both the entry and uncovered exit wounds bleeding profusely. He took a second to assess the damage to his leg before looking up at the Ice Jin, who was still firing volley after volley of finger beams. Smoke and dirt had risen from the impact points on the ground, leaving Trunks shrouded in a cloud of dust. Trunks assumed this was why the alien continued to fire. He couldn't see the teen's force field and assumed his attacks were still going through. Trunks raised his uninjured arm just above his forehead, mimicking his master's trademark move as he waited for the chance that was sure to come. The break in red beams came sooner than he'd expected as Nevius shouted over the rising smoke, You still alive down there? While resting his hands on his hips, Trunks decided to respond with, Masenko ha. He extended his arm and fired the golden flame attack he'd modeled his own burning attack after. Nevius froze, terrified, as he saw the ki blast tearing through the sky towards him. He'd expected a crippled, downed Saiyan with 100 holes pumped through his chest, not a giant beam of energy dwarfing that of a truck. At the last second, the Ice Jin's senses returned, and he flew up, attempting to get out of the way of the destructive attack. He was unsuccessful though, as the bottom half of his body was caught in the blast. The burning flames of the golden Kai left nearly nothing as his legs and some of his tail were torn away from his torso. As he felt his body ripping away from itself, he emptied his lungs, shouting insults that Trunks had never heard before. Finally, the blast passed through, and the Ice Jin looked down, awestruck, at what remained of his perfect body. No, Nevius muttered under his breath as he witnessed the air where his legs and part of his stomach were supposed to be. His hand extended downward and felt at the blood pouring from his now visible innards. Gradually, he began to lose the strength to fly. He started to drop from the sky, slowly at first, but halfway through his descent, his Kai failed entirely, and he came crashing to the ground. Trunks stared, gaping at his victory, watching the Ice Jin's still body for nearly a minute before carefully flying over to the still bleeding, half an Ice Jin. The teen stood victoriously over his enemy for a moment, reflecting upon the battle leading up to this point. Memories filled his thoughts, leaving him unaware as Nevius lifted his head and fired a blood-red beam from his mouth. The blast grazed Trunks' stomach as the teen dodged at the last second. The angry Demisane growled before firing a finishing golden blast that consumed the rest of Nevius' upper torso. Trunks stood in shock for a few seconds before his legs finally collapsed underneath him, exhausted from the strain he'd placed on them throughout the day. He lay back and stared at the stars illuminating the night sky. He tried to lift his hand to rub his damaged shoulder, but soon realized he couldn't. His arms and legs felt like houses were pinning them down as he lay there. At first, he was worried, but soon realized he couldn't move only due to the exhaustion finally catching up with him. Trunks' eyes widened slightly as he felt the Super Saiyan transformation wash away, the familiar glow subsiding so that the only visible light was the stars. He allowed his body to get comfortable on the cracked and uneven asphalt he lay upon, preparing for a light sleep which seemed so desirable at the time. It took only a few minutes of rest before Trunks realized he couldn't sleep there. He was still bleeding from his shoulder and leg, meaning he could possibly bleed to death if he wasn't given proper treatment. He prepared to rise to his feet when he heard a familiar metallic voice several yards away. "I always knew you were an airhead, Rhyme. You didn't need to put a hole there to make it clear." Trunks whipped his head towards the voice and saw an alien with a shiny suit similar to the ones the Ice Jins had worn before, but more detailed. Its back was turned as it examined the bloody forehead of Rhyme's dead body. Panic etched itself onto Trunks' face as he stared exhaustedly at the new opponent. He knew he didn't have it in him to face another full-powered Ice Jin. He quickly scanned the area surrounding him and found a nearby truck tipped over onto its side. The teen carefully lifted himself into the air, making sure not to let any of his body parts hit the ground and make a noise as he flew behind the truck, hiding himself from the Ice Jin. Trunks sat down and briefly stuck his head back out to see whether or not he'd been seen in his escape attempt. Luckily, it seemed he hadn't, as the metallic creature was still examining the body of Rhyme, occasionally giving it a light poke. Finally, the detailed cooler replica grew bored of the body and stepped away, walking around the battle site several times in an obvious search for something, probably looking for that other alien. Trunks concluded as he watched the creature complete a third lap around the battleground. "Well, you're not going to find him, that's for sure. He's as good as dust after how hard I blasted him." The cooler replica stopped walking, seeming to have given up on its search, and took a sharp right towards Grandpa Gohan's stiff-like body. Its back was turned to Trunks, giving the teen the opportunity to peer out from around the truck as he wondered why the alien was approaching his master. The metal Ice Jin stood over Grandpa Gohan with crossed arms before muttering in its monotone voice, "Seems they didn't fail me completely." Trunks didn't have time to question the creature's words as it wrapped its tail around Grandpa Gohan's waist and easily tossed him onto its shoulder before it began to fly up into the air. "No!" Trunks shouted angrily as the alien took off, flying at a speed he couldn't possibly replicate in his condition. He watched anxiously as the metallic cooler flew into the clouds far above and out of sight. The teen would have tracked it farther, but he had failed to sense an energy signature from the Ice Jin and couldn't handle anything but the simplest of flight patterns right now. He realized how foolish he'd been when he'd shouted. What if the enhanced Ice Jin had heard him and turned back around to confront him? What would the teen have done then? Trunks realized how much damage he'd received from just one Ice Jin without the power-up suit. There was no doubt he would have died had he fought the alien. But, why did they take Grandpa Gohan? Trunks asked, both curious and furious. They had already taken his life. Couldn't they leave his body for those close to him to mourn his loss? Tears began to form again at the corners of the teen's eyes as his mind processed yet again that his brother was indeed dead, that he was never going to see Grandpa Gohan again, or so he thought. That's it for this episode, guys. If you've watched to the end, then that may be an indication that you enjoy the episode, so please drop a like so the video could reach more people. See you in the next episode, take care.